Welcome to the 14th episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York and my podcast is about culture wars, the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with lying and astroturf organisations, instead of the real things and the big debates that really matter. I'll be talking to the players and commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening. We'll have some fun and some gossip, and we'll ask some vital questions like who makes the best suede loafers in Jermyn Street, that sort of thing. Now, Katherine Stewart is an American author and journalist who's been following and documenting the development of the American right for the last 20 years and more. She's interested in how it's changed over the period, how it's organised and funded, and what it's achieved. She's written 3 books and countless articles on the subject. Her first book, The Good News Club, is about, as she puts it, the Christian right's assault on America's children, brainwashing, mind-grabbing, whatever. Her second book, The Power Worshippers, is about the dangerous rise of religious nationalism, and it's the basis for a 2024 documentary called God and Country. Her new book, Money, Lies and God, was published in America in 2024 and is now out here. And it pulls it all together, describing what she calls the movement to destroy American democracy, which is quite a charge. It's about money, the quite staggering sums some of the American super-rich are putting into undermining the US state, its structures, its taxation base, its regulatory institutions. For example, one super-rich man has given 1.4 billion, yes, billion, to the cause. Lies refers to the organisation of disinformation of many kinds, particularly what I think we'd both of us call culture wars, to recruit ordinary Americans to support these people's aims, particularly as voters. And God means the way people of many religions, and sometimes none, seem to unite under the banner of Christian nationalism, the idea of a sort of crusade to restore America to a world before civil rights of all kinds, a sort of 50s Christian homeland. This is the difficult bit, of course, for Brits, because we don't do God very much. Stewart concludes that it's all been hugely successful. It's given Donald Trump the presidency twice, and he's given the big funders what they want already in this presidency, namely cuts in government structures, some of them very dramatically executed, cuts in regulation, and above all, cuts in tax. Now, 4 years of this could make America an unrecognisably different place. And since some of its leading lights are saying democracy is dangerous and should be abolished, they seem to be looking for an election-free country. Some might find this profoundly depressing. Good afternoon, Katherine. Now, can it really be as bad as all that? I mean, I've read Peter Thiel. Some of the people you name I've never heard of, but I do know about Peter Thiel, saying he's against elections. But do they really all want a Caesar?
Listen, a lot of them compare Donald Trump to a biblical character like a Caesar or King David, an imperfect ruler that God chose to enact his will. And here's the thing about kings. They're not the kings of democracies. They are the law unto themselves. They disregard any laws that they don't like. And this is the way Trump has behaved. He is flouting the Constitution. He appears to have no respect whatsoever for any laws that interfere with his agenda. And what is he really about? I mean, let's just look at the epic levels of corruption in the Trump administration. It's in our faces. So I think in the past, has there been corruption in the American political system? Yes, of course, to some much smaller degree. But let's look at Nixon, for instance. When he tried to subvert the Department of Justice, his own party got together and said, right, that's wrong. You can't do that. You're out. I mean, we've just never seen anything on this level. And I think a sizable part of the population can't really agree on what to call this or recognizing the reality. So whether it fits our definition of authoritarianism or fascism or not, I'm going to say that the distinctive feature of the present American administration is unfortunately heading toward the same distinctive features of those regimes that we have called authoritarian or fascist in the past. And that is a systematic and essentially nihilistic denial of the truth. It's a denial of facts, it's a denial of reality, and it's a denial of the rule of law.
Now, Jason Stanley, ex of Yale, and Timothy Snyder, ex of Yale, are prepared to say now that this is fascism. I mean, Jason Stanley, talking about his definitions in the books he wrote, the key one is something like 2018, he says those lines that he defined himself have been crossed. And Timothy Snyder appears to be saying the same thing. But are they lone voices? And they've both gone to Canada. Are they lone voices in America?
Absolutely, they're not lone voices. Anybody who's really paying attention is seeing that one of the things about the corruption we're seeing in the present time, which is just one piece of what we're seeing, is that it's not just about personal venality, Trump's personal venality. It has become the way that the government is actually being run. It's becoming the means of how things are done is through corruption, through flouting the rule of law, flouting our constitutional principles, an idea of who gets to properly belong and who doesn't, and the sort of disgraceful and abusive treatment of those who are deemed others, right, who are deemed to not properly belong. And this is something that happens in fascist systems around the world and throughout history, is that leaders of these types of systems deny the truth over and over and over. They don't want you to believe that the truth actually matters. And this is where the lies fits into the title of my book, Money, Lies, and God. There has been a huge investment in these systems of disinformation, propaganda networks that repeat lies and conspiracies over and over and over again, because movement leaders of the anti-democratic movement know very well, if you can separate a large sector of the people from the facts, it makes them easier to control. And this is very characteristic of fascist governments around the world and throughout history.
Now, a number of Europeans, and particularly little British people, find a lot of this astonishing. Maybe they shouldn't, but find a lot of this astonishing because they think, how have they convinced so many ordinary Americans to vote for an agenda that's so much against their own interests? Which raises the question, which we must slap down immediately, are Americans silly or what?
Well, I do want to get something across here that I think is very important. If you think that this can't happen in other countries, such as here in England, I think you really need to think again, because that sort of far-right cohort that wishes to undermine democracy is coming for you too. They have a global anti-democratic vision. They have very large-scale funders, not just in America, but in Russia and throughout Europe. There's a large number of funders. And the people who are funding this movement have extreme political views. So it can't just happen in America. It's not distinctly American, even though there are, of course, nuances specific to different countries and different regions around the world. Some of the far-right groups in America, I do want to point out, have invested very heavily in an anti-democratic movement here. I'll name just a few names or throw out just a few names of people or entities and organizations, funders of the anti-democratic movement in the United States. And some of that money actually ends up being funneled through various organizations over here include members of the Prince DeVos family, Barry's side, who donated $1.6 billion, that's billion with a B, to form the Marble Freedom Trust, which funnels through an organization called the Concord Fund to the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is actually active here in the UK. You have groups like the Heritage Foundation. You have funders like the Bradley Foundation, the Sky Foundation, donor-advised funds like the Signatory National Christian Foundation. You have other family donors like the Eldred family, which is involved in tech, or Tim Dunn and the Wilkes brothers, who are involved in energy and fracking. Here's the interesting thing, or the Uline family. Religiously speaking, the funders are all over the place. Some are evangelical, some are Protestant, some are Catholic, some are Jewish, some are frankly atheistic. I think about some of the tech billionaires who are pouring some of their money into this movement. So religiously, they're all over the place. They have lost, I wouldn't say faith in democracy. Democracy is the foundation upon which their own, and its norms is the foundation upon which their own fortunes were built. Peter, I think there's a bit of a psychology at work. We have a massive concentration, huge, massive concentration at the very tippy top of the economic spectrum in the United States. At the very top of the economic ladder, these people have amassed billions of dollars in fortunes. And that's making life much more difficult for the majority of American families. I would say people in the bottom 90%, there's sort of a top layer of 10% that is doing quite well. But for people in the bottom 90%, life is not as good as it was for their parents, and they know it. So you've got a typical family has two parents and 3 or 4 jobs, and they're still struggling to afford a house and a decent life for their children. And so people at the very top, this sector of funders, here's where psychology fits in. They have a sense that they really don't deserve all of this unearned wealth, but they want to believe, because, a lot of their wealth comes through privileged contracts and government subsidies and things like that. It's kind of a winner-take-all economy. But they have a sense that they want to believe they earned every single penny they have with their bare hands, right? But they don't really want to hear the voices of their critics saying, well, hey, maybe you should be doing a little more to help the poor people in your community, or maybe you should actually be paying your workers a better wage so they don't have to rely on government subsidized healthcare or things like that, which many of these billionaires do. So they don't like the critics, and they live to some degree in these sort of islands of privilege, but they can sort of hear from over the walls, or across the waters, the voices of their critics, and they don't like it. So they want to sort of squelch that. And so they've invested in a range of anti-democratic initiatives in order to not just increase their wealth through, again, privileged contracts, lack of regulation, low taxes for the rich, etc., but also they want to justify their wealth by squelching the voices of their critics. And often they'll call the critics, they give them all kinds of names, the woke communists, etc. Anyone remotely not on board with their agenda becomes a kind of target. In the spaces over the last decade plus that I've been researching this movement, I'm an investigative reporter, so I feel like you need to be in those spaces to really understand what you're looking at. So I've been to countless right-wing strategy gatherings and summits and conferences. I've been to sort of gatherings at extremist churches and a lot of these very conspiratorial places. And everyone, including, I would say, like normal Republicans, people who in an earlier era would have been among that group that told Nixon, oh, you can't be the head of our party anymore because you're corrupt and we really need to adhere to the rule of law. People like that have been really sidelined. They're called rhinos, which stands for Republicans in name only. And in those spaces, you can see people wearing T-shirts with guns that say, I'm going rhino hunting, meaning they're holding this sort of long rifle and they're going rhino hunting. It's really despicable. So anyone from a sort of moderate Republican to a centrist to classic liberal to a progressive to et cetera, everyone in that large and diverse sort of political bucket is called a woke communist. And they're told that they're destroying our country through I don't know, wokeism or whatever that means.
Now, what a typical British response would be, and you say this is highly dangerous, it's unlikely to happen here, or it's unlikely to happen here to the extent that it is there, because there are a number of unique factors about America. One is, of course, that so many Americans are so keen on God, so it's a good factor to use in your culture wars. Another is the incredible fragmentation of your media ecology. And all that makes for a different kind of country. And the fact, of course, the Brits and Europeans always say, enormous numbers of Americans who haven't got a passport and aren't remotely interested in foreign affairs. So they'll shoot rhinos before they shoot us. But are we wrong? Are little British people wrong to think this? You say there are people in the American right-wing plutocracy whose activities extend to Britain and to Europe, and they get together with their friends from St. Petersburg and try and make it worse. I'm trying to imagine where they meet up. Certainly, we were very conscious of Elon Musk saying at one point that he might give Nigel Farage $100 million or £100 million. That's a lot to us.
It is. And a lot of people felt like that was a sort of disincentive to support Farage, because they have this enough sense to think we don't want some other billionaire from, is he American, South African, wherever. Do they want him messing with British politics? No. But we have to look at what has been happening here, okay? Again, there are nuances specific to different places. So let's just look at one thing. After the election, J.D. Vance, who, as you know, has been funded heavily by Peter Thiel, which Peter Thiel also, by the way, funds influence networks and supports in various ways influence networks here in the UK. And we can talk about that later.
Yes.
But so he comes over to meet with UK government officials. So there's a lot to talk about, right? We can talk about the war in Ukraine, the economy, global health, immigration, Europe, innovation, etc., trade. So what does he want to focus on? He berates the UK for supposedly interfering with the freedom of speech. And the only freedom of speech he is concerned about has to be the speech of anti-abortion activists who get themselves arrested whilst harassing people outside health clinics, or the speech of people who want to involve themselves in sort of right-wing positions in the so-called culture wars. Right. So for a lot of the officials that he met with, they couldn't understand it. It was a total head scratcher. They're like, what is he going on about free speech for? Because for most Brits, you know, you can speak freely. You even have Speaker's Corner. People just didn't know what he was talking about. And then a few weeks later, it actually happened again. A different official who was representative of American interests came over to speak to UK officials at the highest levels of government. Again, plenty to discuss, but instead he started talking about Britain interfering with the freedom of speech, which is really supposedly suppressing the speech of right-wing activists. So UK government officials were overall quite mystified. What are they talking about, right? So on the one hand, you can just say, well, that just seems weird. I'm going to shrug it off. Or you can recognize it for what it is. It is strategy. So first, it's loyalty politics, right? The Trump administration is essentially moving to an autocratic model. It has moved to an autocratic model. If you want their cooperation on any issue, you have to demonstrate your fealty, not to rational principles, not to national interest, but to their whims. But more importantly, the right is kind of building a culture war movement around the issue of free speech in the UK, which is exactly what they did in the United States 10 to 15 years ago. It ends up becoming a kind of wedge issue that you can use to divide the righteous from the damned, the pure versus the impure, that you can use to tap into people's issues that relate to identity, that they'll take a very strong side on one way or the other. In the United States, they used for a long time abortion as that kind of wedge issue, along with the issue of free speech. It was a way to tap into people's, honestly, sometimes unexamined bigotries, or maybe perhaps even examined bigotries. They used it to sort of say, well, you can't squelch people who practice race science because their free speech is being interfered with. Or if somebody is denied a platform at a university, they would say they're being canceled. Now, I hate to say this, but I have, under this sort of logic, been supposedly canceled at numerous universities because all the universities haven't invited me to give a speech at those places or have a platform. But yet when they want a speech, like when Jordan Peterson was floated as a person who might be given a platform at Cambridge by someone who was sort of part of that influence network, and some other people who are sort of on a board, they look at a whole bunch of people. They're like, yeah, this person, yeah, this person, nah, this person, yes. They looked at Peterson. I think the initial response was, not at this time, not this person. Not because he's being canceled, because they probably did the same thing to 5 people earlier that day or that week. But then what does Peterson do? He turns himself into a professional victim. He says, I'm being canceled. They're squelching my freedom of speech. He does this in order to get the sort of people who are on board with this movement on his side, to get them to defend him. It's sort of that myth of persecution. And that myth of persecution, the persecution narrative, is a huge feature of the building of any authoritarian movement. But if you think about the sort of free speech being under threat, look at America. Look where it leads. Look where this obsession with cancellation and free speech leads. We have hundreds of words that have been forbidden in government grants and contracts, including pollution and clean energy and woman and diversity and bias. We have universities that now, the Trump administration did this deal now with Columbia University where they can actually, and they're going after Harvard and other universities where they want to control who they can admit into the universities, the kind of curricula that they can teach. This is just from the, I would say, Hungarian playbook. It's a classic authoritarian playbook.
Yes.
They have installed somebody at CBS, which is one of our major news networks, who is going to ensure that there's no, quote, bias, which means that if we say the earth is flat, it's flat, and you can say the earth is round for a minute, but then you have to say the earth is flat. It's a government commissar being installed in one of our major news media. We do not have freedom of speech anymore in America. I mean, we still have some, but there's a lot of capitulation, and there's been a lot of forced capitulation.
And people are frightened.
People are frightened.
Who would you say were the evil geniuses of all this? Who were the outstanding thinkers of this rhetoric, these structures, and fundraisers or fund givers? Who are the really principal people?
This is a great question because there's not one person. There's a leadership cadre. This is a leadership-driven movement. It's not driven by the agenda of the rank and file. And I'd say there are 2 main nodes of the anti-democratic movement in America. There's the sort of religious right, or what people are calling the Christian nationalist movement, which is not Christianity. It's not a religion. It's a movement that exploits religion for politics and power and is anti-democratic to the core. And then there's a new right, which is a movement that is less explicitly religious nationalist, but more explicitly anti-democratic. And I would count Thiel as being a part of that movement. And members of that movement, some of them will adopt a sort of, I would say, religious nationalist ideology, sometimes because they believe it, and sometimes because they have a sort of blood and soil ideology that is bizarre in the American context because, I mean, we're all immigrants, right? Unless you're Native American, in which case that is you're the indigenous to the soil. But some of them just do it as a kind of, well, I guess this is what I got to do to sort of play the game. And they adopt it, I would say, for strategic purposes. So now, who are the leaders? I will throw out some names just for fun. And this is by no means comprehensive. I think of leaders like organizations like Turning Point USA. We've got Charlie Kirk. This is on the religious right side.
Is that the organization that's given the world Candace Owen?
Candace Owen came up through various different organizations, but yes, she's definitely part of that, or has been part of that. So she's one of the speakers. She was, I would say, like a very public-facing propagandist, but I wouldn't call her one of the key organizers, right? I would think about people more like Ralph Reed, who heads up the Faith and Freedom Coalition, which plays a critical role in voter turnout operations. I would think about people like Michael Ferris, who headed up the Alliance Defending Freedom for a bit. And before that, he was very active in the far right, I would say, Christian fundamentalist homeschooling movement, which is a big part of targeting children. You know, they talk about children as strategic machinery. I've been to events where they say, if you want to change the culture, you got to go after those kids age 4 to 14. It is the most strategic age group that we have. And in fact, I read a text by somebody who was talking about the 4-14 window, meaning that children between the ages of 4 and 14 are most fruitful target for evangelism efforts. And so they're going after kids in state schools. They're going after other people's children, basically. Other important leaders have included at various times people like Tony Perkins. If you look at a list of members of the Council for National Policy, which is one of the key networking organizations, you'll see a whole huge list of people. Council for National Policy it's a key networking organization among others. So we've got, for instance, the Ziklag network, which is another very key organizing network. It brings together very high net worth funders with organizational leaders and politicians who are sort of favorable to this agenda. America's First Policy Institute is another key networking organization and policy group. But you also have policy organizations. You've got legal advocacy organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom. Kristen Wagoner is heading that up now, I believe. Liberty Counsel, Matt Staver is heading that up. Pacific Justice Institute, First Liberty, Brad Dacus, I believe, heads up First Pacific Justice Institute. You have vast propaganda spheres, sort of far-right disinformation sphere that separates people from the facts.
Do any of them believe what they say?
You can't know it's in people's hearts. I mean, I've spent enough time in this movement to feel like there are people who truly do believe. They truly do believe. But they're also existing in an information bubble. And they also see that their leadership within this information bubble is very, very good for their own bottom lines. It's very good for their own fortunes. And then there are others that you see and you think, well, for them, this is just about politics and power. They don't believe any of it. They're just doing it because they're laughing all the way to the bank. And they also like power. Back to what you're saying, on the new right, I would say one of the key organizations is the Heritage Foundation, which coordinated Project 2025. If you know what that is, it was a blueprint, 900-plus page blueprint for the current Trump administration that was put together before the election was decided in 2024. And Heritage put it together with a collaboration of over 100 other organizations. So again, this movement is leadership driven and it's organization driven. And I would say Project 2025 is a marriage between the religious right and the new right. On the new right, you have the involvement of other think tanks, like, for instance, the Claremont Institute, which is an extraordinarily influential right-wing think tank. And a lot of its leaders now have positions within the Trump administration, like Russell Vogt, who's the director of the Office of Management and Budget and has played an enormous role in the destruction of the government that we've seen carried out through Doge and through other means.
And is Project 2025, Trump denied it, of course, but is it significantly the ground plan for what's actually happening and about to happen? Is it really what they're following?
Yes.
Pretty much. Pretty much. So if we were all to read the many pages of Project 2025, we would know what the plan really was and what was coming next.
The amazing thing is they told us what they were going to do, and then they did it. Then they say, look at what we did. They told us they were going to smash the administrative state, which is the functions of an effective working government. And that's exactly what they've done. They've also said they're going to Russell Vogt and his, previous organization stated that they were going to implement Christian nationalism to I'm paraphrasing here, to the highest degree possible. And that's on the agenda, absolutely. They've been doing the big moves first, which is, of course, destroying the functions of an effective working government, rejiggering the economy in a way that it's going to mainly benefit people, again, at the very tippy top of the economic spectrum. The American dollar has fallen. Americans have lost their jobs. Prices of consumer goods continue to rise. These needless trade wars are really affecting the average, those people of the bottom 90% of the economy. It's not helping them. And yet so many of them were persuaded to vote for the anti-democratic candidate, for Trump, because he said, I'm going to lower prices of eggs immediately. I'm going to fight for you. So there's another psychology at work here. I think in a deeply unequal economy, people are often legitimately angry. Those rank and file voters who can no longer afford the houses that they grew up in, right? Because, they think, well, when I was little, my dad worked and could support a family on a single income. My mom didn't have to work. When we kids were little, we had good state schools that we could walk to. And now they're saying, we didn't have a whole lot of, corruption and crime in the government or elsewhere. And so then they look around and they see that their own state schools have been degraded through underfunding. They see their health care has diminished, the quality of their health care as a result of healthcare costs run amok in America. They see people at the tippy top, like Jeff Bezos, wasting how many billions of dollars on his wedding? Just Google Jeff Bezos's houses. And then meanwhile, Amazon has hollowed out a lot of American towns by forcing the closure of mom and pop shops. And people who work on his factories or his warehouses often don't make enough money to own a house. Some of them are seasonal people who end up living in their cars. So they look at this and they're angry. And so those legitimate grievances are easily exploited by the anti-democratic movement. You can blame your problems on a woke elite, even as they themselves want to be a new elite, and in fact are now a new ultra-wealthy elite. They neglect to show that the billionaires funding this movement are driving support for politicians whose policies are actually making it harder for most American families to succeed. But as long as they say, we stand for the American family, unfortunately, a number of people will believe them.
And is there a woke elite anywhere? I can't see it.
No. We do have a plutocratic elite, and I will note in America that's only a sector of the plutocratic class that is funding this movement. But the right and the left, when I say left, I mean very big tent, right? Moderate, liberal, etc., progressive left, they spend their money differently. The right tends to invest in organizations and people. And so a lot of this activity isn't directly coming from the Republican Party. It's funding these outside organizations that are influencing and have ultimately ended up controlling the Republican Party. And on the sort of other side of the political aisle, people tend to invest in technocratic solutions or sometimes in politicians. And the thing about technocratic solutions, they think, if we can only just solve, like Biden invested a huge amount of money in alternative energy, which drew a lot of jobs to red states, to Republican states. Well, did that change the votes? No, it didn't. And then one of the first things that Trump did, he cut all the funding for those energy investments. And all those red state people who've had those jobs in alternative renewable energy development, they've lost their jobs now. But you can believe that they're not going to say, wait, Biden gave us that. They're just going to say, well, Trump says it's the immigrants who are doing this and the outsiders and the people who don't truly belong in America.
Why are the centre-left and the centre-right, what's left of it, and everybody else apparently so powerless against this juggernaut?
Wow, great question. I think that part of it has to do with the strange way, the sort of quirky way in which American political system is structured. We have supposed to have three branches of government: And now Trump is doing a lot of these things unilaterally, amplifying the power of the executive wing at the expense of the power of Congress, which is supposed to balance it out. And there are a lot of lawsuits. There's one now explicitly questioning, it's coming up very soon in one of our circuits, which is right, below the Supreme Court. We have a number of circuit courts, and then we have the Supreme Court saying, well, Trump can't establish these trade policies, these lunatic trade policies, without Congress agreeing. The way our system is structured, we're supposed to get congressional approval for this kind of thing. So that's going to be tried in court to see whether it's even feasible or not. But it's for this reason that the anti-democratic movement has been so intently focused on capturing the courts. We have, in advance of the 2016 and 2024 election, I went to gatherings of right-wing strategists and activists, and I would hear speakers say things like, this election is about judges, 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 because they know if you can capture the courts, you can impose policies on the people that are not popular and that they wouldn't stand a chance of passing if they were put to a democratic election. So billions of dollars have been focused on capturing the courts. You have this vast far-right legal ecosystem with groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which, by the way, Peter, has an annual operating budget of over $102 million per year. Per year. That's a lot of money. A lot of money buys a lot of law. And that's only one of the other right-wing legal organizations that is focused on mounting certain cases, bringing them to certain courts, placing justices in place, Supreme Court, federal courts, lower court justices in place. The Federalist Society is another group that has played an outsized role in shaping the courts. They find and groom and promote sort of right-wing legal talent. Leonard Leo was the head of the Federalist Society for many years. That fellow, Barry Side, who donated $1.6 billion to form the Marble Freedom Trust, which is funneling all this money into the anti-democratic movement in various ways. Guess who he put in charge of his Marble Freedom Trust? He put Leonard Leo in charge of it. And Leo is then managing the funneling of many tens of millions of dollars to groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and other players in the right-wing legal ecosphere.
How did these people find Trump? How did he find them? What is the meeting of minds? What happy accident is this?
Well, there is one happy accident, and her name is Paula White. Paula White is a pastor who was based in Florida. She had a church with her former husband called Without Walls. And she's a pastor in the charismatic tradition. If you know what that is, they speak in tongues. They imagine themselves to be, apostles and speaking directly to God. And they, you should just Google Paula White speaking in tongues. It's really something to see. Well, the way she described it on a Christian news platform, which I watched, was one day she was doing her thing. She gets a call from Donald Trump, who had, that house in Palm Beach, Mar-a-Lago, and he wanted to meet her. Now, I know you said we do some gossip, but I try not to be too much of a gossip. But I will say enough of this.
Go on.
Paula White fit the model of what I think someone like Donald Trump would have thought was very attractive. So he probably saw this lady who he thought was very attractive. Paula White's a beautiful lady. He probably looked at her and thought, well, she is power. How does she do that? And she's got followers. How does she do that? So Paula White has actually claimed credit for connecting Trump with other leaders in the charismatic end of the Christian nationalist movement. And I can't know exactly how it all happened, but I will tell you that in 2013, I was sitting in New York City in a pastor gathering, because this is a story, the rise of the religious right as a political force has been a big preoccupation of mine as a reporter. So I was in New York City at the Marriott Hotel in Midtown. I'm with maybe 500 pastors in the room, and they're all very political pastors in New York City and beyond. And a guy named Louis Bush? He was like a leader, a sort of big, charismatic, I would say, super pastor. One of these guys who fills stadiums, in third world countries.
Yes.
And gets everybody to pray, and he speaks in tongues, and they all speak in tongues. He gets up on stage, he said, "You'll never guess who I met. I just met with Donald Trump." And I nearly fell off my seat. I thought, why is he meeting with Donald Trump? But then, before you know it, Donald Trump is running for president. And in advance of the primary, he got together, this is very well reported by the New York Times and the Washington Post and others. He got together with over 1,000 pastors in New York City, and he promised them 3 things. He was clearly cultivating them. He said, "I'm going to have an evangelical advisory council. I'm going to choose Mike Pence as my vice president." And then he held up a list of judges as though they were a list of shiny new bonds. And he said, "I'm going to choose justices from this list. And all of these judges are pro-life." And the deal was cinched. Movement leaders know if you can get the pastors, you can get their congregations. And so a lot of these pastors have been drawn into networks with names like Watchmen on the Wall or Faith Wins or Church United. I've been to these pastor gatherings. In some instances, they might have a dozen or a few dozen pastors. In one instance, there were 400 pastors in the room, each of whom commands a congregation, right? And you had leaders standing up there saying, it's your biblical duty to turn out your congregations to vote. And they need to vote for biblical values. And then they give very sophisticated materials that leave absolutely no question about which candidate these pastors are supposed to get their people to support. For instance, they'll distribute voter guides that say, this candidate is pro-life, and there'll be a check mark next to the Republican and an X next to the Democrat. Or it's always like abortion, same-sex marriage, a certain definition of religious freedom, which means the right of people with certain religious views to discriminate against others of whom they disapprove. Newer issues, of course, include trans stuff, because that's a sort of massive distraction. I think of it as like the shiny bauble of the moment of this movement, because it affects very few people, but everybody seems to have an opinion about it.
Steve Bannon once described Trump back to Michael Wolff in 2015 when he was talking around the Trump circuit as possibly having potential for his people, Bannon's people, but possibly being an empty vessel who didn't believe anything.
He certainly believes in money for himself and his family. Yes. We can say that. That is absolutely Trump value. I mean, that's very interesting. Steve Bannon is, I would say, very clever, but he's also doing a lot of performing when he stands up there and pretends to stand for the working people. He gets up there in his scruffy flat jacket, half-shaved, and just stepped off his friend's yacht. I saw him speak recently at a gathering put on by Turning Point USA. That's Charlie Kirk's organization. They played an important role in turning out the vote for the 2024 election. And Steve Bannon gets up there and he says, I want Old Testament retribution. He talked about how he really wants to, and this is after they won the election. Trump has never stood for uniting the whole country. He never has. He ran on division. At every Trump rally I ever attended, he said, the greatest threat to our country is not our foreign enemies. As dangerous as they may be, the most dangerous threat we have in our country is within. And he was talking about anyone who is not on board with his agenda. And, Bannon is echoing this kind of talking point. He's talking about those bad wokesters who supposedly want to allow women and people of color to be in positions of, work as doctors and lawyers or whatever. These are just the angriest group of winners I've ever seen. But they ran on retribution, and now they're determined to carry it out. And you can see it in the absolutely disgraceful way in which they're carrying out the deportations of America, some people, asylum seekers, people who actually helped American troops in Afghanistan, have now been targeted for deportation. They said they were going to go after the worst of the worst. And yes, okay, if you're an illegal immigrant and you've committed a crime in America, you have to pay the price for that, whatever that price may be. But often these are people who have green cards. They've gone through the system. They're doing everything that they're supposed to be doing. In many instances, there are people who've been working in our country for decades and were brought in as children as young as 2 or 5 years old. They've been working jobs, paying their taxes, raised children who have joined the military and things like that. And now they're not just being exported to their home countries, they're being deported to like offshore gulags for weeks or months, or perhaps even indefinitely. It just doesn't make any sense. Studies have shown that the majority of people who have been deported in this manner have never been accused of any crime at home or abroad. And some of those have been accused of like, oh, you let your driver's license lapse or something like that. Mm-hmm. So we're also treating our foreign visitors in a really grotesque manner. Former aides to the U.S. military and other outrageous actions.
Can they really be, these people, as destructive and nihilistic as any anarchist ever in history in their teens and 20s? How can they sustain this when they're getting their way?
You know, I refer to this movement as a form of reactionary nihilism. It's nihilistic because they deny with their actions more than their words, I would say, that truth has any real value in this world, that there is really that truth matters at all, right? It's all about power. And they seem to have no value other than the values of money and power. And then reactionary in that when they talk about what they want, it's always some imaginary version of an American past that never actually existed in the way that they seem to imagine that it did, where all Americans are somehow all implicitly white Christians who believe a certain way. And we forget that in America, we forget about this our history of immigration and how almost every immigrant group that's come in has been the target of hatred of some kind, from the Pennsylvania Dutch when they came in. Pennsylvania Dutch. There were massive employment and social discrimination. When Catholics started to immigrate to America in large numbers, they were massively discriminated against. Irish faced signs that said no Irish need apply in employment settings. When Italians started to immigrate, they were not considered white. And some Eastern Europeans were not considered white. There was a nativist physician named Henry Storr. And I remember there's a quote where he said, "Our America South and West be filled with the children of aliens." He was talking about Catholics. And he said, or our women, he said, "Upon the loins of our women, the future of our country depends." He was also an anti-abortion activist, and he wanted Protestant women to basically have more babies and outbreed the Catholics. I mean, there are so many groups that have experienced discrimination over time in America. And yet this is a movement that seems to imagine, again, this reactionary nihilism, that there's some glorious past where everyone somehow shared the same heritage and the same religion. In the American context, it just isn't true.
No, but we've seen it in the film, so it must be, of course. Now, I'm beginning to think that all those people who did all those investigations about Moscow 1975, Moscow 1987, Compromat and Trump should have been looking at the seductions of the Christian right and charming ladies and rich gentlemen of the Christian right who might have brought Trump over to their enthusiasms.
Well, have you ever heard of a lady named Maria Butina?
No.
Oh. Well,
Maria Butina.
I wrote about Maria Butina for the New York Times op-ed, and the question I asked was, what was Maria Butina doing at the National Prayer Breakfast? So Maria Butina was, or appeared to be, this very nice, very young college student at American University in Washington, D.C., who somehow just had a real interest in guns, in American gun culture. And she was also really interested in Christianity. So she was all of a sudden became really good friends with all of these right-wing politicians. And there are all these pictures of her in situations with a series of male right-wing politicians. And she was invited to the National Prayer Breakfast. It's an annual gathering in Washington, D.C., where I would say politicians and also a lot of foreign dignitaries come together and talk about how great it is that they're all particular religion, etc. So she was there, and later she was found to have engaged in some shenanigans related to sort of sharing of information and sensitive material that she had gathered from these various Christian right politicians and gun enthusiasts that she had gotten close to. I think she was sent to jail. In America, she had to serve a sentence, and then she was deported to Russia and hailed as a hero.
You're absolutely right. And now you say it, I remember her along with that guy in Trump Tower who aroused a lot of Russian Americans to buy Trump apartments and all those sorts of stories, which I treasured at the time, and then fall out of your head because of the pandemic and everything else. Now, can you, when you think of these assembled groups, these funders and rhetoric creators and so on, are there dress codes that distinguish them? Can you recognize them from a couple of paces?
Are we talking about clothing?
Yes.
Yes.
Clothing, get-ups, etc.
There are different, I would say, clothing norms depending on the sector that you are dealing with. So when you go to a gathering, as I describe in my book, of a gathering of Reawaken America, which is a big far-right MAGA QAnon propaganda fest, people are wearing T-shirts with "I'm going rhino hunting" slogan or biblical slogans on them that are often cited in charismatic religious circles, sort of certain kinds of American flags. There's a lot of sort of red, white, and blue stuff. Roger Stone did nothing wrong is another slogan I've seen. A lot of T-shirts. And the interesting thing about the clothing in those spaces is that it suggests that these people are neither rich nor poor. The men are wearing sort of, when they're not wearing their slogan T-shirts and this sort of weird military gear or military light gear, they're in like Tommy Bahama T-shirts, Hawaiian T-shirts and jeans. And they are, I would say, overfed but not fat, right? Not in a super unhealthy way.
Mm-hmm.
The women are wearing jewelry and clam diggers, and the clothes are not the cheapest, but they're not the most expensive by any means. They suggest that people are in the sort of lower to lower middle rungs of American society. The sectors that are getting left behind by the information economy, by the vast unequal concentrations of wealth at the very top of the economic ladder. And the women sometimes wear sparkly stuff. You also see some of that in some of the gatherings of like the Road to Majority conference, which I try and go every year. But Road to Majority conference, it's an annual gathering that Ralph Reed's organization, Faith and Freedom Coalition, puts on. It's a gathering of far-right activist, strategists, religious right leaders, and politicians favorable to their interests. And in those spaces, there's definitely dress codes. People are more professionally dressed. The women are often wearing suits. There's been this trend in recent years for women to wear kind of pantsuits, but it's more like a kind of long, kind of slinky top that hits right above the knee, and then matching trousers and like sparkly sandals or something like that. The women's, everybody's done the fingernails, the cheeks, the lips. It's all, the women are very heavily made up. And the men are often wearing suits. There's always a young cohort. The girls are in skirts and jackets, and the boys are in jackets. They're all encouraged to sort of dress up in this kind of way. I mean, there are different, and when you go to like a national conservatism conference, people are well-dressed in general.
Yep.
It hits home the fact that they claim to be populist. They claim to stand for the working people. But you get the sense that they're more, it's sort of like one part of the elite is really at war with the other part of the elite, rather than representatives of the working man are there to sort of talk about how to make society more equitable.
One of the speakers in the London NatCon was Danny Kruger. Danny Kruger, son of our favourite mature food speaker. Danny Kruger from Eton. Danny Kruger from all those things, and very, very properly dressed. Because the whole thing of the class elements in the totality of Magaland is endlessly fascinating. I don't think seriously dirt poor people belong there, do they?
Well, this is, again, a leadership-driven movement. So the gatherings that target the rank and file, like Reawaken America, look very different from gatherings of the World Congress of Families, which, by the way, we were speaking earlier about, or NatCon. So we were speaking earlier about the Russian influence. There's a huge amount of Russian money that has gone into the anti-democratic movement, not just in Russia, but across Europe.
Yes.
It's been a huge funder of the movement in various ways, and they want to shape policy in ways that are more favorable to their interests, of course.
Mm-hmm. I wish I could have gone to NatCon, which I think was 23. It's up the road from me, practically. I've been in that hall for all sorts of other things constantly, and it's a very good setting.
It's beautiful.
And I watched what I could on TV. Nobody looked at all deprived or particularly crazy. I could talk about this forever. This is absolutely fascinating, and more Europeans should know about it. So power to your elbow, as we say, in getting it to us and to people in Europe. I hope you're touring the world with it.
Well, there was actually a very interesting report that was just released by the European Parliamentary Forum. They have a kind of section that deals with sexual equality and reproductive rights and things like that. And they released a 158-page report titled "The Next Wave: How Religious Extremism is Reclaiming Power." And they follow in some detail the people, the organizations, the different actors in different countries that are funding this movement. They talk a lot about U.S. funding in Europe, but they say we can't blame all of this on America. Europe has a lot of its own homegrown funders, including certain tech funders, very wealthy people who made their money on tech. So they have their own sort of right-wing tech sector. They also talk about there are a lot of families that want to bring back a certain idea of religious values and tradition. And in a way, it's this sort of version of this old alliance between priests and kings, isn't it? In a way, if you think about how do people who are in this very privileged situation entrench their wealth? Well, often they'll do it through religious initiatives that teach people to stay in line.
Now, as I gather, the American right is very enthusiastic about the Hungarian setup. I'm conscious that in turn, the Hungarians fund a most curious think tank in Brussels, run by a British academic originally from Hungary called Frank Furedi. Are you across this fascinating development?
Frank Furedi, that's really interesting. He used to be on the far left.
Yes.
And then he sort of flipped and went to the far right.
Yes.
People on the extremes of one side or another, you see a lot of that. They call it the horseshoe theory, right? You go so far off in one direction, all of a sudden you're off in the other direction. They're using that often to talk about people who go so far off to the left that they end up on the right. And one thing I would say about some of the far left activity that we see in America. I can't really speak to the British context. And when I talk about far left, I write about this in my book, Money, Lies, and God. There are these organizations that are taking these incredibly, I would say, completely uncompromising positions that say both sides are so bad, we can't play politics, we just need to insist on our purity. And the effect of their actions ends up redounding to the benefit of the right.
Yes.
Because sometimes they literally do end up being voices for the right, like Frank Furedi. And then sometimes they end up suppressing or depressing sectors of the vote in ways that redound to the benefit of the right.
Katherine, you've given us so much to think about in every way. Principally, it couldn't happen here, it could happen here, it couldn't happen there, it could happen there. And going back to your book and following the various strategies and the various mechanisms and saying, can we see any of that here? Can we see any of those people here? Can we see any of those influencers floating about? Matthew D'Ancona wrote a brilliant piece in Tortoise called Bannon's Britain in, I think, 2018, which would give all of us some food for thought. So thank you very, very much indeed for sparing the time to talk to me.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I feel like a lot more we could have discussed, but I feel like we covered a lot, and it's been a really lovely conversation.
Well, you're sometimes here, aren't you?
Yes.
So maybe we can have some more conversations and possibly on platforms.
I would love that.
Little British platforms. Well, I shall aim for it.
That will be my pleasure.
Thanks a million.
Thank you.
Many thanks to Katherine Stewart. We're taking a break over August, but watch out for my second series starting in September, when I'll be talking to more players and more commentators in these culture wars. Culture Wars House Party is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do listen in again. Goodbye.